Morocco's Generation Z 212. A generation against global abandonment. Like a shock wave that knows no boundaries, Generation Z's protests against inequality and injustice are sweeping the world with the force of a collective cry that refuses to be silenced. It's not just a murmur, it's a roar born of exhaustion and disappointment. This generation, which grew up surrounded by screens, social media, and almost immediate access to information, has become an unexpected political and social player for the governments of many countries. This is not a homogeneous group, but rather millions of young people who, although they live different realities in Morocco, Nepal, Chile, or the United States, share a profound and painful commonality. They no longer tolerate corruption, inequality, or the abandonment of their most basic rights. The spark that lights the global bonfire, from Morocco to Nepal. Once Nepal, now Morocco, the epicenter of this global uproar. There, the young people who make up this generation raised their voices against the precariousness of the healthcare system, a precariousness made evident by the deaths of several women in hospitals under deplorable conditions. Outrage grew into a movement when Moroccan youth organized themselves digitally, decentralized, and anonymously under the name Generation Z 212, using social media to call for demonstrations in multiple cities. The number 212 corresponds to Morocco's international telephone code. By adding it to the name of their movement, the young people made it clear that their struggle is both local and global. It's a way of saying, we are part of the global Generation Z, but we also speak from Morocco, from our specific reality. The name also reflects the digital culture of this generation. Short, symbolic, easy to go viral on social media, and easily identifiable by anyone inside and outside the country. From Nepal to Morocco, one same fed-upness. Let's not forget that in Nepal, the trigger for the Generation Z-led protests was the government's attempt to control social media. That attempt was not only seen as an attack on freedom of expression, but also as a reflection of the government's disconnect from the true needs of the people. In practice, the anger wasn't limited to the internet. It was the result of exhaustion accumulated over years of basic infrastructure deficiencies, a lack of decent jobs, and a growing sense that young people were being completely ignored. The same thing happened in Chile in 2019, when an increase in the cost of public transportation became the spark that ignited a national movement against inequality. Although this increase was the trigger, the protests escalated. And one of the most important structural complaints was the high cost of living and socioeconomic inequality, where university debt is a determining factor that suffocates thousands of families. Governments have always believed that this generation has no interest in public affairs, but they are wrong, as they have always been there whenever society has needed them. In Chile, high school and university students led massive protests that were documented by various media outlets. Although the trigger seemed minor, the root cause was the same as in Nepal and Morocco: discontent with systems that prioritize the benefit of the few over the well-being of the many. Morocco, the pain that turned into protest. In Morocco, the trigger was even more dramatic. Several women died as a result of poor hospital conditions. The news quickly circulated on social media, and within hours, became a symbol of state neglect. Young Moroccans reported that while their mothers, sisters, and neighbors were dying due to lack of adequate medical care, the government was allocating millions of dollars to building stadiums and preparing for the 2030 World Cup, which Morocco will host along with Spain and Portugal. Outrage has turned into a powerful slogan: "We want hospitals, not stadiums." The marches were organized primarily by young people who used TikTok, Instagram, and WhatsApp as rallying tools. These protests were without visible leaders, a very characteristic style of this generation, which relies more on digital coordination than on the figure of a traditional political leader. The squeezed generation, exploitation, and deferred dreams. The true heart of Generation Z's malaise lies in the labyrinth of job insecurity. The lives of millions of young people are marked by the paradox of being the most educated, interconnected, and technologically savvy generation in history, yet whose working life is doomed to exploitation and underemployment. The university degree as a mirage. Many of them carry a university degree in their hands, a scroll that was once the promised passport to a dignified life, and which today is little more than an expensive ornament. They have master's degrees in finance, bachelor's degrees in engineering, diplomas in communications. But the system has chained them to the cash register in self-service stores, logistics warehouses, or telephone service. Their abilities are wasted. They are hired for one job, but are required to perform countless other tasks unrelated to their training. The promise of meritocracy has proven to be a cruel mirage. These are the young souls who see their bosses, protected by lax labor laws, demanding they work much more than their normal schedule without fair compensation. Their grueling days extend beyond what is humanly tolerable. They work 6, even 7, days a week, with barely enough time to sleep for a few hours before the alarm rings again, dragging them back onto the production line. Health lost in the rhythm of the machine. This is a generation that doesn't just lose its future, it loses its health in the present. Due to their hectic schedules and physical and mental exhaustion, most don't have the time or energy to eat healthy. Lunch breaks are reduced to a handful of minutes, enough only to consume ultra-processed foods loaded with fat, sugar, and preservatives. Energy drinks and low-cost foods become the toxic fuel that keeps their bodies afloat. The result is a silent deterioration, an increase in chronic diseases at early ages, sleep problems, anxiety, and depression. This reality is not an individual coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the system of exploitation that demands always available bodies and always alert minds. And the most outrageous thing is that governments, and the companies that employ them, don't seem to care about this erosion of health. A sick body is simply a replaceable cost in the machinery of capital. The shadow of student debt. In countries like the United States, Canada, and much of Europe, precariousness has an additional scourge: student debt. Billions of dollars in loans hang like a sword of Damocles over the heads of recent graduates. Many young people have to spend the first 10 or 20 years of their working lives, the very stage of their most productive life, working just to pay off a past, to settle the debt that gave them the right to an education. They don't graduate with an opportunity. They graduate with a mortgage of knowledge. The pressure is such that most of their salary disappears into monthly payments, leaving them with little room for survival. Their youth becomes a credit settlement, a race without a finish line where the only prize is the release of a financial obligation. The broken mirror of inequality, luxury versus poverty. Generation Z lives in an era of forced transparency through social media, and this has magnified the contrast between their reality and that of those in power. The generation of excess, the global political class. For millions of young people, their aspirations for a stable life are constantly humiliated by the ruling class's obscene display of wealth. While they calculate whether they can pay the rent and bills at the end of the month, social media reveals the lives of the families of elite politicians and bureaucrats. Dream vacations and exotic destinations, paid for with funds of dubious origin. Designer clothing and luxury accessories, worth more than the annual salary of a young professional. Children of rulers who flaunt mansions and sports cars without ever having worked in the real labor market. This blatant inequality is not just a question of wealth, but of moral justice. Generation Z sees how nepotism is the currency of exchange, how the children of rulers obtain contracts, how companies do multi-million-dollar business with the governments themselves, and how they rise to political power through inheritance rather than merit. The anger intensifies as the rules of the game are rigged. The elite perpetuates its power and wealth, while working-class youth inherit only debt and precariousness. The cement betrayal. Pharaonic works against the hole in the asphalt. The unrest isn't just about the luxury of the elites, it's about the tangible neglect in their own cities. In the neighborhoods where the majority of this generation lives, the streets are riddled with potholes, debris, broken sidewalks, and basic infrastructure is falling apart. The contrast is stark. They prefer to build pharaonic projects like stadiums and airports, or remodel government facilities destined for international acclaim, and the enrichment of contractors, rather than invest in replacing the drainage or water systems in their cities. The existential connection: climate and flooding. Infrastructure abandonment is no longer just an aesthetic or mobility nuisance. It has become an existential threat due to climate change. Year after year, Generation Z sees their homes flooded with the first rains, and their essential means of transportation, such as the subway in various cities around the world, collapse and fill with water because drainage systems have not been modernized. The murky water that floods the subway or its neighborhoods is the liquid symbol of corruption and negligence. Governments build monuments to ego while condemning their citizens to a life of constant risk. The dream of a life, a delayed utopia. The great tragedy of Generation Z is that the future has ceased to be a promise and has become a utopia. The dream of adulthood, the one their parents or grandparents could achieve with effort and hard work, is now an unattainable fantasy. Owning a home. It's become a mere figment of the imagination. Most people work just to cover the ever-increasing rent, and the mortgage feels like an insurmountable mountain. Car ownership and vacations. They're no longer middle-class goals but luxuries. Vacations are a distant memory, replaced by extra shifts to pay off debts. Living wages. The fight is for a wage that not only allows you to survive, but to truly live, that gives you the freedom to breathe without the constant anxiety of the end of the month. Having children. The project of starting a family and giving them a better life is increasingly difficult, as economic instability and the lack of resources for childcare or quality education force them to postpone or forego parenthood. They have been robbed of the possibility of hope, condemning them to a cycle of subsistence that seems designed to make them work only for the system, without ever sharing in its true benefits. Conclusion: the unstoppable echo of awakening. The Gen Z protests in Morocco, Nepal, Chile, and beyond are not isolated events. They are part of a pattern that crosses continents and cultures. A generation that, tired of empty promises and living on tenterhooks due to debt and exploitation, is coming out to demand what should be obvious: healthcare, education, decent employment, and zero corruption. The slogan, "We want hospitals, not stadiums," is much more than a Moroccan cry. It is the universal echo of awakening. It is the cry of a generation that has understood that its greatest power lies in its ability to communicate and organize. The world's politicians are not correctly reading what is happening at the geopolitical level. They haven't realized that the generation most adept at handling social media and communications is no longer willing to accept an uncertain future. They are no longer willing to continue living as if they belonged to the silent generation. Millions of young people are raising their voices to say, enough with corruption, enough with politicians who despise them, and enough with governments thinking that they, the most connected generation in humanity, are not interested in public affairs. The future cannot wait any longer.